Imagine this. You are a government duty officer on a quiet night shift when the hotline rings and two fighter pilots talk over each other. They report an object with no wings, no exhaust, and a velocity jump that makes the radar technician whisper, "That cannot be ours." You write coordinates, note the abrupt climb to impossible altitude, and schedule a dawn briefing. That urge to document, verify, and brief is where the real story of official UFO investigations begins. Not whispers in a hangar, but interviews, reports, and data that try to make sense of surprising skies. From the late 1940s onward, governments built programs to handle the flood of strange reports. The United States started with Project Sign in 1948, an Air Force effort to gather sightings, compare them with known technology, and publish formal estimates. Sign analysts interviewed pilots, cross-checked meteorology, consulted astronomers, and tried to match lights to aircraft, balloons, or planets. Their tentative conclusion was conservative. Most cases were explainable, yet a small residue refused to collapse into the obvious. In that residue, some analysts saw a puzzle worth further study, while others warned against speculation. In 1949, the Air Force replaced Sign with Project Grudge, shifting the tone from open curiosity to caution and debunking. Grudge worried about panic, wartime rumor, and Cold War propaganda. Many incidents were filed under misidentification, optical illusion, or psychological contagion amplified by headlines. Still, certain radar visual cases resisted quick answers. When multiple independent sensors, ground observers, and trained aircrew lined up, the data demanded more than a shrug. That tension between reassurance and rigor shaped the next 2 decades. By 1952, Grudge evolved into the better-known Project Blue Book at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Blue Book standardized intake forms, coded characteristics, and coordinated with weather units, radar stations, and telescopes. Thousands of reports moved through the pipeline. The majority became routine. Venus, low on the horizon, aircraft seen head-on, inversion layers bending radio waves, balloons released at dusk. Yet hundreds remained unknown after interviews, site visits, and cross-checks. Those files did not declare extraordinary conclusions. They recorded the limits of available information and the reasons a conventional hypothesis did not fit. 2 famous episodes illustrate the process. In July 1952, the Washington, D.C. radar events forced Blue Book and civilian controllers to cooperate in real time as targets appeared, vanished, and returned, while interceptors chased phantoms across the Capitol. Debriefings examined scope calibration, temperature inversions, pilot angles, and timing. The official explanation leaned on atmospheric effects, yet several controllers remained unconvinced that air alone could sprint off a screen. In April 1964, near Socorro, New Mexico, a police officer reported a close approach to an egg-shaped craft on the ground, scorched brush, and 2 small figures. Investigators photographed marks, tested soil, and compared the timeline with experimental aircraft activity. The case ultimately retained the label unknown, not as a declaration of the extraordinary, but as an honest statement that the available data did not resolve it. Blue Book also intersected with 2 major reviews. The CIA convened the Robertson Panel in 1953 to consider method and public communication, recommending better filtering and educational outreach to reduce false alarms. Later, the University of Colorado study led by Edward Condon re-examined case material in the late 1960s. Its final report judged that UFO studies had not produced significant scientific breakthroughs and recommended closing the Air Force program. In December 1969, Blue Book shut down with a public statement: no evidence of a threat to national security and no verified proof of exotic visitors. Yet, the reporting procedures, classification logic, and habit of archiving lived on inside broader air safety and defense channels. Across the Atlantic, the British Ministry of Defense maintained its own intake desk for decades. Officers compiled letters, telephone calls, police logs and aircrew reports, then circulated them to radar units and the air defense community. When the MOD released files in the 21st century, readers saw bureaucratic diligence, hand-drawn sketches bearing lines on maps, annotations about satellite passes, and cover notes asking whether exercises might explain lights. The Rendlesham Forest events of December 1980 show the tone. US personnel stationed in Suffolk reported lights in the trees, unusual marks on the ground, and elevated readings from simple field instruments. British and American officers exchanged memos, walked the site, and tried to reconstruct lines of sight against a lighthouse and celestial objects. The outcome was not a cinematic revelation. It was administrative paperwork that preserved conflicting testimony and attempted to reconcile it with geography and timing. Belgium added another chapter during the 1989 to 1990 wave. Police and civilians reported large triangular craft moving slowly and silently above towns. The Belgian Air Force coordinated with radar sites and scrambled fighters. On some nights, radar tracked targets that executed accelerations hard to reconcile with known aircraft. On others, the tracks collapsed into clutter consistent with atmosphere. The Air Force later published a sober summary that distinguished between misidentifications and stubborn cases, and it emphasized method, correlation across sensors, caution about night observations, and restraint in drawing conclusions. France institutionalized long-term study within its national space agency. GEIPAN, operating under CNES, built a public database with classifications from identified to category D, meaning unexplained despite solid data. Investigators conduct interviews, reconstruct lines of sight, check astronomical conditions, and sometimes stage on-site reenactments using the original viewing geometry. The emphasis is on traceable reasoning and public education. Chile created CFAA to address pilot safety in a country of mountains, ocean routes, and heavy aviation traffic. Its case notes blend cockpit testimony with radar tapes and meteorological context. Brazil's historical Operation Saucer in the late 1970s produced military reports about luminous phenomena in the Amazon Delta, followed years later by document releases that gave researchers a better sense of how patrols logged events and interviewed citizens. Several individual incidents entered the international literature because they triggered formal reporting chains. In 1976, over Tehran, Iranian Air Force crews scrambled to intercept a luminous object and reported instrument failures and loss of weapons control near the target. Summaries circulated among foreign partner agencies for situational awareness without theatrical conclusions. In 1997, the Phoenix Lights over Arizona produced mass civilian testimony and official comment. While later statements pointed to training flares for part of the night's activity, the early intake illustrates how authorities separate simultaneous events and ask whether witnesses across large distances described one object or several. In 1989 and 1990, the Belgian wave tied together ground observers, law enforcement, radar logs, and fighter debriefs, creating an unusually rich dossier that continues to anchor discussions about methodology. The vocabulary shifted in the 21st century from UFO to UAP, but the investigative logic stayed familiar. Defense organizations funded efforts to collate encounters, analyze sensor data, and brief legislators. Temporary task forces matured into a standing office that supports the defense and intelligence communities, harmonizing reporting and encouraging pilots to speak up without stigma. Separate from defense, a NASA-led independent team examined how the scientific method could be applied to ambiguous observations, highlighting the value of calibrated instruments, open data standards, and careful metadata. The newer structures do not promise dramatic answers. They promise better questions and better measurements. Step back from the acronyms and patterns emerge. First, normalize reporting so pilots, controllers, and citizens can speak without ridicule. Second, triage quickly. because most events have ordinary causes. Third, invest deeper effort only when multiple independent strands align: radar, infrared, visual observations from trained witnesses, and logs with exact timing. Fourth, publish summaries that clarify what was checked and why a label was assigned. Fifth, archive everything because later tools may extract meaning from old noise. That workflow is neither glamorous nor trivial. It is the practical backbone of public administration confronting rare anomalies. The human element matters. Investigators learned that memory is plastic, angles are deceptive, and sky conditions at twilight can fool even experienced observers. They also learned that dismissiveness corrodes safety. A pilot who expects mockery might not report drones near a runway or odd returns inside a training range. Modern guidance tries to thread the needle. Neither sensationalize nor stigmatize. Read across case files from different decades, and you see the language mature from excited speculation toward careful phrasing about certainty, confidence intervals, and instrument behavior. Equally important, the best reports are transparent about limits. A radar return without context can be atmospheric. A cell phone video without reference points can mislead. Night photographs often compress exposure in ways that manufacture streaks and geometric shapes. Good investigations state assumptions, cite uncertainties, and list alternate hypotheses. They avoid the trap of declaring certainty on thin evidence. That restraint is not a dodge. It is the core of professional inquiry and a sign that aviation culture believes in disciplined skepticism. Why does any of this matter today? Because controlled airspace is more crowded than ever with commercial traffic, hobby drones, hypersonic experiments, and autonomous systems. Unknowns are not simply curiosities, they are potential hazards. When a training area reports fast-moving targets that do not transmit identification, the correct response is exactly what these offices recommend: standardized reporting, analyze sensors, and brief decision makers. That response was as appropriate during balloon scares in the 1950s as it is amid modern drone swarms. The global mosaic reminds us that curiosity is not confined to one nation. Canada partnered with libraries to preserve decades of reports. Spain and Italy released batches of military cases after internal reviews. New Zealand published files on airline sightings along ocean corridors. Each archive adds a pixel to the shared picture. Lots of noise, occasional structure, and a small number of events stubborn enough to justify continued attention. None of that demands a single dramatic conclusion. It demands steady, methodical work. So if you came for a promise that tonight ends with a saucer in a hangar, official investigations will disappoint you, and that is a compliment. What they deliver instead is a documented history of how institutions respond when reality presents a puzzle. They log times, places, instrument states, and witness statements. They test mundane hypotheses first, and only then admit that some cases remain unresolved. They improve forms, add training for observers, and request better sensors. In other words, they do the unsung labor that eventually makes shocking events less mysterious. The hook that keeps the story alive is not a secret revelation, but a public commitment. Each time a government opens an archive, publishes a methodology, or invites pilots to report without stigma, the dataset grows. Centuries ago, mariners mapped coasts through repeated voyages. Today, investigators map edge cases of the sky the same way. The next meaningful breakthrough is unlikely to arrive as a whisper from a locked room. It will come from more calibrated instruments, more consistent metadata, and a culture that rewards careful reporting. For creators like us, turning these investigations into a compelling episode means respecting the paperwork while keeping the pace. We open with a scramble call, then a case file sliding across a desk. We let the viewer feel the checklists, the interviews, the site visits, and the quiet moment when an analyst marks unidentified and adds a cautious note about data quality. The drama is human, not theatrical. Professionals confronting limited information and choosing diligence over drama. So tonight's video is not about what governments might hide, it is about how they actually investigate. From Sign and Grudge to Blue Book, from Modi desk officers and Belgian radar rooms to CNS analysts and Chilean aviation boards, from debriefs in dim corridors to modern task forces with updated acronyms, the through line is the same. Look, measure, compare, document, and improve. The sky will keep throwing puzzles at us. Our job, and theirs, is to keep turning those puzzles into knowledge, one careful report at a time. If you want a single image to take away, imagine a clean worksheet pinned to a briefing board. Date, time, location, witnesses, instruments, confidence level, disposition. That simple template, used carefully across decades and countries, is the real star of this story, quietly turning confusion into usable knowledge. And it keeps getting better with transparency.